Frederick Douglass had his picture or portrait taken more times than any other American in the 1800s. Think about that. That's more than Abraham Lincoln, Mark Twain, Harriet Tubman, and U.S. Grant. But did you know that Frederick Douglass was a slave before he was a famous writer, publisher, and speaker? And have you ever wondered how a famous person and a very smart man like Frederick Douglass escaped slavery in the 1800s? Oh wait. Hi, my name is Jeremy, and welcome to Elwin Studios. A common way of escape for slaves was to borrow somebody else's free papers. You could take those papers and travel wherever you wanted with proof that you were free. But on those papers had a description. In that description, it said that you were this tall, and you looked like this, and you had these scars, and you had this kind of hair. So you had to look exactly, or pretty close, to the person that you were borrowing those papers from. Frederick, being the 6 foot some 200+ pound man that he was, didn't know anyone that matched his description. But he did know a sailor that was willing to help. Now, a sailor's pass is a bit different than a regular free pass. It had a symbol of an American eagle on it, which made it look more official. And the more official a document, the less likely somebody's gonna ask you questions. Frederick packed his things and headed to the train station, dressed up as a sailor. He knew exactly how to act and talk because he spent most of his workdays in a shipyard with other sailors. And to avoid the initial security, he got on the train right after it started moving. Sneaking in and taking his seat, Frederick pretended to be a sailor on his way to the Atlantic. And the train started to sped towards the Maryland, Pennsylvania line, and everything was looking good. Until the conductor came into the car to check everybody's tickets and papers. Frederick's entire future hung on the decision of this conductor. Would he overlook the wrong description, or would he send Frederick back into slavery? Things were not looking good for Frederick, as the conductor came down the aisle. The man was going through people's papers in a very impatient and somewhat harsh way. It looked as though Frederick would either have to bribe his way out of this, or jump off a speeding train. But then when the conductor came up to Frederick, his entire attitude changed. Sailors in those days were generally very well respected. So instead of demanding that Frederick pull out his papers right away so that he could look through every detail, the conductor instead patiently asked whether Frederick had his papers or not. Frederick, trying to keep from shaking, slowly pulled out his sailor's pass. Frederick explained that a sailor never takes his free papers out to sea. Instead, he carries his sailor's pass. He showed the conductor, and the conductor held the document for what seemed like the longest 2 seconds of Frederick Douglass's life. But that was it. It was only 2 seconds. The conductor, apparently seeing the eagle as enough proof, handed the paper back and moved on to the next aisle. Frederick sat back in his seat, relieved that he was still free. But as it often happens in stories like this, Frederick was not out of danger yet. We need to note that in Frederick's hometown, he worked with a lot of people over the years. So somebody in that cart was bound to recognize him, even in his sailor's uniform. The invention of the railroad had improved significantly over the past few years, but it wasn't going fast enough for Frederick still. In his autobiography, he said that seconds felt like minutes, and minutes like hours, and hours like days. At one point in the ride, a blacksmith that Frederick knew very well was staring at him for the longest time. Frederick was sure that the man recognized him, but just didn't have the heart to betray him then. At one of the stops along the track, Frederick's train came up, and a southbound train came up on the other side. When Frederick looked over at the window on the other end, he saw a sea captain that he had worked for just a couple days before. He was sure that his heart was pounding in his chest and that the people around him would have heard it. The two trains sat there for what seemed like an eternity. But in the end, the captain never looked out his window, and the southbound train moved on. Frederick was now at the last step of his dangerous journey. It was a transfer from train to a steamboat. This last stretch in Frederick's journey to Philadelphia was probably the one that worried him the most. In order to get onto a steamboat, there's obviously the security. And security in Maryland to get onto the trains was a very tight and strict business. The steamboat was no different. But this time, there was no getting around it. There was no jumping on after it got going like he did with the train, and swimming up to a boat, whether it was before it got moving or after, would definitely cause a stir. All that was left for Frederick to do now was to walk up in a fake sailor's uniform with a piece of paper that said he could go sailing with a description of somebody that looked nothing like him. But once again, the paper was looked over, Frederick walked onto the steamboat, and soon he was in Philadelphia, free. If you want another abolitionist origin story, you can click on this video here, and if you want to subscribe to whichever channel one of my editors decides to put up, you can click on this button here.